Let me begin with the first session entitled Nuclear Competitions and Security Challenges in East Asia, DPRK Policies of ROK, U.S., and PLC, and the scenarios of military confrontations. It is perfect timing for us to have this kind of conference today. First, as far as I know, it is the first major international conference in Seoul right after the Washington Declaration by ROK U.S. Summit. If you can have a chance to read the North Korean basic materials, such as the Nodong daily newspapers or KCNA, it is very interesting for North Korea, shows a very detailed and serious response to the Washington Declaration. And second, it is also the one of the first trilateral international conference between ROK, U.S. China, under the difficult situation of COVID-19, also the little bit difficult situations between the U.S. and China. I personally hope that the top level of foreign officials of both the China and the United States will sooner or later resume their delayed meetings in the second half of this year. For that kind of purposes, I think the first step we should do is develop much more deeper understanding of each other's policies and positions toward the opponents. Third, it is also the rare occasion for us to discuss the theme. We will have a discussion from a little bit longer perspective of decisive decade of 2030s. It seems that we are approaching the dead end of whether we can develop new kind of the strategy of symbiosis, or we will face much more catastrophic situations. In that sense, I think the first session is critically important for us to develop the new perspective on the difficult topics. To have a discussions, we, EAI, invited 3 globally eminent scholars, experts, and also 3 very much famous discussants. Let me introduce 3 presenters and also discussant. To my left, Matthew Byrne is the professor of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. His specialties on the deterrence and arms control, and also the nuclear proliferation issues. He also served as an advisor to the Office of Science and Technologies. And in addition, he awarded the winner of most prestigious award, and also he's the author of the more than 25 books on the topics we will discuss today, and also more than 150 articles. And next, Professor Jiaqinghe from China. He is a professor and former dean of School of International Studies at Peking Universities. He taught at the major university of the United States, and he served for the University of Peking University quite a long time, and he maintained very close relations with the EAI, and he has been a member of the Standing Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. He's also the director of the Institute for China-U.S. People-to-People Exchange of the Ministry of Education. He also published quite extensively on the major topics, including the East Asian peace and security issues and U.S. China issues. And third presenters will be the Park Won-gon. He is the currently professor in the Department of North Korean Studies and director of the Institute of Unification Studies at Ewha Women's Universities. He also served as a chair of Center for National North Korean Studies at East Asian Institute. He is one of the leading scholars in ROK on the North Korean studies and also the international relations of East Asian arenas. In addition, we also invited the three discussants. First, let me introduce the John Park. He is the director of the Korea project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Balfour Center. He also advises Northeast Asia policy-focused officials and the U.S. government, and he is quite active and published major publications, and also he played the important role to represent the ROK and relevant powers position on the Capitol Hill. And third discussant, our second discussant, Zhang Tuosheng. He is the chairman of the academic committee, the Grandview Institution, and the senior fellow at the China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies. Previously, he was the deputy defense attaché at the Chinese Embassy, United Kingdom. And another important discussant will be the Dr. Kim In-han. He is an associate professor of the Department of Political Science at Ewha Women's University. He is currently serving as vice president of international affairs at the school. He received his PhD from University of Virginia. He also worked on the major issues of peace and security issues on the Korean Peninsula and also the East Asia arena as a whole. Because of time limit, I think three presenters will sum up the basic positions less than 12 minutes. And after three presentations, three discussants can use roughly 7 or 8 minutes to have a productive comments on the presentations. let me invite the Professor Matthew Bowen as the first presenter.
All right, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. It looks like my slides are already up, although it looks like the translation to Korean computers did some damage to the formatting, so I hope they won't be too bad. Mic is not working? How's that? Yeah, that sounds louder than it should be. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure in particular to be able to have a dialogue between these three important countries. I am totally in agreement with my Chinese colleague who will speak after me that unless we can find ways to build cooperation as well as whatever disagreements we have between the United States and China, the world will be a lot worse off. My paper, though, focuses primarily on issues here on the Korean Peninsula, but I think the issues I'm going to talk about apply to competitors everywhere. That the main point that I'm trying to make, next slide please, is that whenever you make a key decision, you need to think about what your adversary or competitor is likely to do in response. So Otto von Bismarck, the German leader, remarked that it's very dangerous to play chess one move at a time, to think only about the move you're going to make and not the move that the adversary will make in response and what that will mean to the game. And so the problem, one of the problems is misperception, that what the United States and the Republic of Korea may see as completely defensive, the North Koreans may see as an offensive threat that they need to respond to, and that response may endanger our security. And so to maximize our security, each time we're making a weapons purchase, laying out a military plan, taking a military action in a crisis or conflict, we need to think about how will that look to the other side and how will they respond and how will that affect our security. Next slide, please. So think about in a crisis or as it might evolve into a conflict, imagine that the North Koreans commit another awful provocation, shelling an island again or something like that. Excuse me. South Korea might well believe that it was necessary and reasonable to strike back to reestablish deterrence. You could imagine that North Korea might see what the U.S. and ROK forces had done as an escalation and might use a few conventionally armed missiles, perhaps on U.S. air bases, to interfere with what we were doing and as a warning. But once the North Koreans started using missiles, the United States and the Republic of Korea might well decide we need to go after the North Korean missiles with the kill chain approach. That then puts the North Koreans in what strategists call a use them or lose them position, where if they don't use their nuclear weapons, they might not have them anymore. And the campaign to hunt for and destroy the North Korean missiles might look to North Korea very much like the campaign that would be the prelude to invading North Korea. And so there's a real danger that that might provoke North Korean nuclear use. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, I think that core deterrence is likely to be very strong. U.S. and ROK forces combined can certainly defeat a North Korean invasion of the South if it's conventional only. And North Korea knows that there would be gigantic risks to the survival of its regime if it were to use nuclear weapons. So I worry more about the inadvertent steps to war when a crisis or small conflict is getting out of control, the things that happen that neither side initially intended before the conflict began. And so we have to think about the risk of what we may be provoking with each military action that we take. And the lessons of the crises of the Cold War, which we've been exploring in a bit more detail in a project we call Data for Deterrence in our Harvard group, is that crises are really very difficult to manage. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, there we are. Okay. So John F. Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, drew a number of lessons, but two of the important ones, I think, were, one, you always have to give your adversary some face-saving way to get out of the crisis without escalating the war. Two, in a crisis, modern militaries are large, unwieldy organizations. All sorts of things happen that neither leader actually intended. As he pithily put it, there's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the word. Next slide, please. So the need to deter without provoking the adversary to do more does create difficult dilemmas. The United States and the ROK, of course, would want to maintain conventional superiority over North Korea. And yet, if you look at these crises of the Cold War, when one side was really conventionally inferior, they were more likely to consider the use of nuclear weapons because they had few non-nuclear options. For example, West Berlin was completely surrounded by Soviet or East German forces. There was no way to defend it with conventional forces alone, and so the United States planned to use nuclear weapons early in a conflict if the Soviet Union ever tried to seize West Berlin. Fortunately, that plan deterred the Soviet Union from ever trying to seize West Berlin. So similarly, the ROK and the United States would like to maintain the ability to threaten North Korean missiles, North Korean leadership, but that threat then provokes the North Koreans to think, I need more, better, different missiles to keep my force survivable. And those dilemmas are not unique to this peninsula. They exist between the United States and China. They exist between the United States and Russia. There are certainly things the United States and NATO would like to do that would help Ukraine in its war that they don't do because they fear that it would provoke Russian actions that would be contrary to Ukraine's interests and to NATO's interests. And similarly, there are many things Russia would love to be able to do to prosecute its war in Ukraine that it doesn't do. It doesn't attack, for example, weapon supplies to Ukraine while they're still in NATO countries because it fears the result of provoking NATO. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we are. So ultimately, deterrence requires reassurance of the adversary. As Thomas Schelling put it, stop or I'll shoot implies if you stop, I won't shoot. And you have to convince the adversary that you won't shoot if they stop. And so reassurance becomes a fundamental part of successful deterrence. Next slide, please. So what kinds of things could we do to try to mitigate some of these dilemmas? I think if we can find a way, and so far North Korea is just rejecting any outreach, but if we can find a way, reducing the temperature and the hostility and the intensity of the hostility on the peninsula is, I think, the most important step we could take. What? Keep on the previous slide. No? No? There we are. Systematically including the risk of provocation in our planning. We ought to have a group whose job is to constantly assess and be the sort of voice of provocation risk in a certain sense. There are confidence-building measures that could be taken, some of them unilaterally, even if North Korea isn't responding, some of them jointly if and when we manage to get back to talks with North Korea. And then ultimately, if we do manage to get back to talks with North Korea, they're not realistically giving up their nuclear weapons anytime soon. We should keep denuclearization as the long-term goal, but in the near term, we should focus on particular restraints that we think would reduce the risk. And we need to do more thinking about exactly what we would ask for in those first steps and what we would offer in return. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ha, and many thanks to the East Asia Institute to invite me and my colleagues. It's great to work with our Harvard colleagues. I'm not going to go over my paper again, but briefly I'll focus on a few points. First of all, as I said in my paper, that the so-called strategic competition is something that is imposed on China. China has never accepted the term. The term first came up actually during the Bush Jr. administration. Around the time he got into the White House, he started to say that China-U.S. relationship is a strategic competition. And then we had 9/11, and then he dropped the term. The term was reused again by Trump after he came into office. But China has never accepted the term strategic competition to describe the relationship. Why? Because first, China believes that such kind of a description is too negative. From Chinese perspective, we don't like, to describe our relationship as competition. Actually, in the Chinese tradition, we compete under the table rather than in public, in politics. This is very untraditional from a cultural perspective. Secondly, Chinese do not believe that this term captures the complicated relationship between the two countries. Okay. Of course, we have areas of competition. We have even areas of confrontation. But a very important aspect of our relationship is cooperation. We tend to forget that when we talk about competition. So China has been very reluctant to accept the term. Sometimes you hear Chinese officials talking about positive or constructive competition as opposed to malign competition. I wrote an essay on this. a short essay on this a couple of years ago. But again, competition is not a term that Chinese government wants to use to describe the relationship. The third point I want to make is that the U.S. determination to engage in a strategic competition with China has resulted in a pattern of behavior that has made the relationship between the two countries increasingly difficult and confrontational. We heard, we have seen tariffs imposed during the Trump administration. We have seen high-tech decoupling that has been going on since the Trump administration, and the Biden administration is accelerating this process. And also supply chain redirecting. That's part of the strategy of the Trump and Biden administration. And also military preparation. So you see, despite the huge deficit the US government is facing, actually they are having a great difficult time to figure out whether they should set a ceiling for it at the moment. They are increasing the US defense budget quite dramatically. And above all, and also building anti-China coalitions. We have Quad, in addition to a lot of military alliances around China. And above all, the efforts to challenge China's territorial integrity and sovereignty over Taiwan. Okay. And of course, in the Chinese eyes, the most offensive and perhaps the most dangerous thing the US has been doing is to challenge China's territorial integrity and sovereignty over Taiwan. During the past decades, the U.S. has reneged on all the three commitments it made for normalization of the relations between the two countries, meaning, suspension of withdrawing diplomatic relations. Let me say. Now, the U.S. has basically restored a lot of official relationship with Taiwan. And also aberration of the treaty, mutual defense treaty. Now the U.S. is renewing its defense commitments with the relationship with Taiwan. And also withdraw troops from Taiwan. And now the U.S. is sending more and more military personnel to train Taiwan troops of the Taiwan authorities. So it's under that kind of circumstances that China is rethinking its strategy of peaceful unification. Okay. The U.S. Congress, after Biden came into office, I think U.S. policy on Taiwan has become less volatile, less officially moving in a more provocative direction. But the Congress has become a major actor, increasingly proactive. So you see dozens and dozens of Taiwan-related bills and resolutions passing in the Congress. Groups and groups of members of the U.S. Congress going to Taiwan as if they don't have anything to do. and two speakers of the House, Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy, competed in putting the Taiwan problem on the headlines at China's expense. Okay. So the U.S. policy of containment against China constitutes efforts to take China's stake out of the existing international order, one piece by piece. Okay. So if it is successful, if U.S. successfully deprives China of its stakes in the existing international order, then it would put China back to the 1950s and 60s, when China did not have any stake at all in the international order and vowed to do whatever it takes to overthrow that order. And unlike the old days, however, China is much stronger today. So it has much more capability to whack the order if it finds in its interest. So it is against this background that Chinese are debating their country's nuclear program, nuclear policy. Okay. China's nuclear policy has three major components to it: minimum in number, no first use, and non-proliferation. Okay. So as the U.S. challenges China's territorial integrity and sovereignty over Taiwan and China's efforts to stop them in recent years, military confrontation and indeed war between the two countries over Taiwan have become increasingly likely. And given the increasing threat the U.S. poses to China, increasing number of people in China subscribe to the idea that it's time for China to reconsider its nuclear weapon policy. Okay. Some argue that China should drastically increase the number of nuclear weapons. Okay. Like Hu Xijin, he talked about 1,000 warheads as opposed to a couple of hundred. And there are other people who argue for even more. Okay? And some people in China believe that China should change its no first use policy. Okay? The US has not committed to it. Some other nuclear powers have not committed to it. Why should China commit it to no first use? And some other people believe that since the U.S. has changed its non-proliferation policy by supplying Australia with with nuclear submarine, and is considering deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Japan and South Korea, China should also change its policy on non-proliferation. Okay. What that means is that if the U.S. decides to supply nuclear material or weapons to countries hostile to China, China should do the same to the U.S. Okay. So that's the argument by some people in China, and it's gaining currency against the contest of deteriorating U.S.-China relations. At the moment, China's official position remains to adhere to its long-standing nuclear weapon policy. However, if the U.S. pressures on China, especially on the Taiwan problem, will increase, then China probably would have to reconsider its policy on nuclear weapons. So, if one does not wish a nuclear arms race, nuclear proliferation, or maybe a nuclear war between China and the U.S., it's time to urge the U.S., especially the U.S. Congress, to stop messing up with China's territorial integrity and sovereignty over Taiwan, and work with China to manage their differences and engage in cooperation where their interests overlap between China and the U.S. And other countries should resist the pressures to take side and exercise their influence to make it clear that they oppose China-U.S. confrontation and would act accordingly. It is never too late to do a good thing. So let's hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jiaqing. Next turn will be Professor Pa.
It is my honor and privilege to be here. And at the same time on this stage, there are two Dr. Parks, John and me, and also two professors from Ewha Women's University, which is I'm very proud of that. Okay, actually I received the three guiding questions from the organizers, EAI, so I will follow these three questions. And since I'm teaching at the Department of North Korean Studies. We'll talk about the North Koreans' perspective and what their intentions and goals at this very moment. And you probably know very well about the North Korea's very serious provocation last year. They launched more than 70 missiles, which is the highest numbers in their history. And still, they continue to have this kind of a provocation this year too. And I think North Korea has continued to so-called align its policy direction that has been declared in December 2019. I know you know that 2019 is the most important year because February, the break of the Hanoi summit, and North Korea has returned to the old policy. And according to their line, and it's actually called frontal breakthrough line, which is a little bit weird translation, but North Korea has used that translation. In Korea, we said that 정면 돌파전. But anyway, there are 4 very important principles in that the policy direction. First, self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and it's very common theme that North Korea has used for past several decades. And then second one is ideological confrontation or struggle. They are going to strengthen the ideological indoctrination for their own people. And third one is confrontational policies toward the South Korea and United States. And finally, they are going to develop their nuclear weapon in the most sophisticated way. And it's going to be a long-term struggle against these 2 countries. I don't think there is any change for the past couple of years about this policy line or policy direction or line. Still in 2023 May, at this moment, I think North Korea has continued to this kind of policy line. The ultimate goal is pretty clear that North Korea want to be a de facto nuclear weapon state that has been recognized and acknowledged by the whole world, especially from the United States. And then the total CVID or the denuclearization of North Korea is a very unrealistic goal, and that's what they ultimately want at this moment. And second guiding question that I got from the organizer is that the key escalation pathway on the Korean Peninsula and those kind of things. Okay, I will talk about the kind of very distinctive characteristics of North Korea's provocation this year. I think a very clear differences between this year and the last year, previous year. First, North Korea has expressed a very clear intention that this year's provocation is targeting against South Korea and United States. Even though North Korea has such a large numbers of the military, the missile provocation last year, they haven't mentioned clearly about the targeting to South Korea or the United States. Instead, they talk about this is just for their ordinary, the weapon development plan. In 2021, North Korea held 8th Party Congress, and they introduced 5-year defense development plan. And North Korea has, after conducted several missile tests last year, North Korea has mentioned that this is what they just follow, this 5-year defense development plan. But this year, every time they fired the missiles, they are saying that this is against South Korea and United States. And second one is, I think it's very serious because North Korea, for the first time in their history, the last year, the September, they launched the missile during the South Korea and United States joint military exercise. During this joint military exercise, North Korea has never, ever have any kind of provocation for past several decades. So definitely this is reflect their confidence on their nuclear capability. And in this year, the March, we have, South Korea and United States have a huge scale, the joint military exercise, which has been called Freedom Shield. And during this time period, North Korea has one more time conducted a missile test. And third one is North Korea deployed missiles for tangible warfare rather than the mere test launches. Every time this year they fired the missiles, they said that this is not just development stage, but this is actually deployed in the field, and they just train for their military exercise. So that's another important differences compared to the previous year. And fourth, and I think Professor Von already mentioned a little bit about that, North Korea is trying to diversify their platforms. We see the various ways to launch missiles, the mobile launchers, trains, reservoirs, even they launched the missile in the golf course lake. And it creates huge kind of cost for the South Korea, United States, because I think South Korea, United States enough capability to deter and even strike this kind of North Korean missiles. But if North Korea continue to expand this platform, and then it will create huge amount of money to prepare for the North Korean's possible attack. And finally, I think this is the most important differences. And this is North Korea's, this year, they are talking about their missile launches and provocation against South Korea and United States to their own people. The last year, more than 70 missiles, but very few times they just mentioned to their own people. But this year, right after they launched the missiles, and they are, released to their official newspaper like Nodong Shinmun, and then they said that this is against South Korea and United States. I think this reflects the current North Korean situation. We all know that North Korea has very serious economic difficulties. So this is their typical way to respond to this kind of domestic difficulties by creating the tension around the Korean Peninsula. We call it as seize mentality. North Korea has continued to say that they've been seized by the South Korea and United States. So overall, this is the very new kind of a trend, phenomena that we are seeing at this year, which is very serious. And about the possibility of seventh nuclear test, I still believe that we should not exclude the possibility of seventh nuclear test. And I think there are two reasons that North Korea wanted to have a seventh nuclear test, both military, technologically, and also politically. So I'm not going to go detail, but we have to prepare the possibility of North Korea's nuclear test. But at the same time, last year, North Korea has also faced some serious challenges. And I mean, there is some repercussion about North Korea's relentless pursuit about their nuclear weapons. First, we are seeing that the very growing cooperation among three countries, trilateral cooperation, South Korea, Japan, and United States. And you know that South Korea and finally overcome those for past several years difficulties with Japan, finally try to normalize relations, and at the same time, this month, we will have another trilateral summit between three countries, and we are already conducted several military training. And this is a kind of a huge burden to North Korea, because North Korea has to right now respond to this kind of joint effort by three countries, which is a military high. We have all the high-tech military the weapons. So at the same time, North Korea has suffered economically. We all know that technically this is third year that actually they still blocked their border. Of course, they are very limited open to Russia and China, but not fully open at all. So, and at the same time, Kim Jong-un himself mentioned in the 2021 at the 8th Paris Congress that he showed this plan that North Korea will develop their economy to the 1.4 times bigger in target year until 2026. And last September, North Korea held the Supreme People's Assembly. Kim Jong-un confirmed this the goal one more time. But we all know that that is impossible goal, because if North Korea wanted to develop the economy for 1.4 times bigger than the previous years, and they have to developed every year at least 4%, but we all know that in 2021, according to Bank of Korea here in Korea, say that North Korea has just 0.5% of developed, and I don't think this kind of trend will never change. But we see, in order to have some kind of economic achievement, it is inevitable that North Korea should come to the negotiation table and at least doing some kind of meaningful denuclearized measure, denuclearized step. And unless they weren't doing that, there's no chance that any kind of the sanction relief or sanction lift and lately. Okay, then I will move to the third questions, and that is about the arms reduction and what is the goal of denuclearization. Of course, there are many debate about this one right now, especially in the United States, and there are some group of people saying that the who complete denuclearization of North Korea is definitely unrealistic. So we have to pay out. I mean, some of the U.S. people saying that, Americans say that we have to pay more attention about the freeze of the especially North Korea's ICBM development, or we have to focus on the partial denuclearization instead of the full denuclearization, which is a very serious challenge to South Korean people. You all know that in South Korea we have at least 60-something% to 80% support their own nuclear armament. I hope this Washington Declaration can reduce this kind of public support for the own nuclear armament still, but it is true that many people in Korea worry about this, the North Korea's nuclear development. But these kind of things we have to think about. If just the United States are talking about partial denuclearization without any kind of a clear goal of the full denuclearization of North Korea, will create huge kind of problem here in Korea. Because I'm running out of time, I'm going to stop here. Actually, I want to talk about the South Korean policy, but I still don't have time. I hope I will have a chance to talk later.
Thank you so much for the comments there. I've been asked to comment on Professor Jia Jingguo's paper as well as Professor Park Bong-gun's paper. And so I'll keep it brief here. With Professor Jia's paper, I wanted to start with the context and something of diagnosis as well. If you look at it from the perspective of perception versus reality, I do think it's important to frame our discussions with an examination of three key events. The first one was 2001, 9/11, and 10 years of the global war on terror, a period where, from a US perspective, that was the #1 global priority. There are many developments that are happening today that are rooted from that time period that I do think we have to investigate and examine it more closely. The second is the 2007 global financial crisis. This was a period where, particularly for the United States, if you look at it from the perspective of the ability to respond to a crisis that was extremely swift, that required unprecedented type of measures, it is something that revealed the side of the vulnerability of the United States in that respect as well. The third is the early days of the pandemic, and where the US responds to it, in many respects, a type of reaction that took much longer. It was learning by doing as that played out as well. The point I wanted to emphasize was that what we see here is an important dynamic of perception being greater than reality. I do think there is an overhang from these three particular periods where still colors a lot of the analysis in terms of particularly the US role, US reactions. But the historical reality is that the US is resilient and adaptive. So we really need to increase the aperture in terms of how we are looking at some of these flows. Otherwise, a core assumption of a lot of the analysis is that the US is in the process, an irreversible process of decline. The historical record doesn't show that. The second point I wanted to emphasize here, and this is leading up to a question to Professor Jia, is with your formulation of the imposed strategic competition, this is in reaction to the period prior where there was a big emphasis in China on trying to establish a new type of great power relationship as it was framed back then. If this is currently the US formulation, as you mentioned in your paper, of an imposed strategic competition and clear differences in definition and understanding between the United States and China, how do you see China seeking to set its own path? Clearly, this is not a dynamic in terms of the imposed strategic competition. So how are you seeing the formulation of a path forward that is proactive, not reactive from the Chinese side? The second one, when we look at it from the perspective of the immediate period that we're in right now, and it's not a period that will go away anytime soon, the increasing focus on economic statecraft. With this, as you pointed out, Professor Jia, there's a lot going on in terms of the US, in terms of the use of economic statecraft, particularly in the area of restricting advanced microchips. And with that, the examples here, the high-tech decoupling, as you pointed out, I think the revision and the adaptation in terms of the terminology in Washington now is it's de-risking aspects of it. But the question to you is, how do you see China's responses to the U.S.'s increasing economic statecraft? Up until now, we haven't seen much by way of action. If you could shed some more light in terms of what some of the debates and some of the thinkings are in China related to how China may respond to the increasing use of U.S. economic statecraft. And switching to Professor Park Kwon-gun, this is an area where I'm curious how you're seeing the key criterion factors, the ones that you apply to assessing the effectiveness of enhanced deterrence that would match the growing DPRK nuclear threat. First question. And the second one is, clearly two key highlights of President Yoon's state visit to Washington. Number one was the Washington Declaration, and the second one was a nuclear consultative group. The focus now is squarely on how to implement. A big focus of discussions that our group, other groups are engaged in, is designing and implementing this type of process. So for you, what is essential in your mind's eye when it comes to designing this process? Clearly there's a lot to build out. And what are the priorities that you see? And then finally, this is something that I'm curious about. We hear a lot about South Korea soft power. And if President Yoon's visit to Washington was a focus on hard power, when we hosted him for his speech in the Kennedy School Forum, there was a big focus on soft power. President Joe Nye moderated the event, and in one of the responses that President Yoon gave to our student, President Yoon's explanation, I thought was very nuanced in terms of soft power. And Professor Nye said that if President Yoon were a student at the Kennedy School, he would give him an A. So with that as the context, what role do you see for South Korea's soft power in deterrence, particularly in telling the complex story of South Korea's current circumstances and how that would inform the international community on next steps? Thank you.
Chang Joo-shun.
Thank you. First, I'd like to share with my view on North Korean nuclear capability and its threat. Back in 2017, DPRK reached initial nuclear strike capability. Since then, amid deteriorating China-US relations, especially the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, the DPRK has gotten a rare opportunity to develop its nuclear capability and expand its nuclear arsenal. Since last year, the DPRK has been developing all kinds of missiles and appears to have become a missile power. At the Workers' Party Congress in January 2021, Kim Jong-un said, the DPRK has made a huge achievement on nuclear program. To base on this in the future, DPRK will develop a variety of tactical nuclear weapons, push ahead with the production of ultra-large nuclear warheads to strengthen actual combat capability. What he said is somewhat exaggerated, but not totally groundless. Since last year, the international community has been deeply worried about the possible DPRK's seventh nuclear test. But North Korea has not conducted it till now. I don't think it's necessary for the DPRK to conduct a new nuclear test. India and Pakistan have each conducted 6 or 5 nuclear tests, and none since. The DPRK's nuclear capability is now sufficient to deter the U.S., Japan, and the ROK. Although it doesn't have the nuclear capability to attack the U.S. mainland, and its hydrogen bomb test has not been successful. Last year, the DPRK issued a new nuclear force policy decree, which changed the known force use policy of nuclear weapons proposed several years ago and specified 5 circumstances under which it could use nuclear weapons first. This obviously increases the risks of nuclear conflict. One possibility is miscalculation of the DPRK could lead to a nuclear conflict. Another possibility is in the event of a serious military conflict between the U.S., the ROK, and the DPRK. The DPRK would use nuclear weapons first for its survival. The third possibility is U.S. could launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the DPRK if it believed the DPRK could use the nuclear weapons first. In addition, some Chinese experts have a little bit different thinking. They think the possession of nuclear weapons, the DPRK's possession of nuclear weapons may reduce the possibility of conflict and the war on the peninsula. But at the same time, the risks of nuclear proliferation may greatly increase. This year, South Korea's President Yoon said ROK would consider developing nuclear weapons. If ROK goes nuclear, what about Japan? If the situation continues, there would be a nuclear domino effect in Asia. And this will be followed by a serious increase in nuclear security and safety risks. In addition, the development of the DPRK's nuclear forces will give the U.S. the best excuse to deploy land-based intermediate missiles in East Asia, strengthen anti-missile deployment, and increases the deployment of strategic assets on the peninsula, which will pose a serious threat to China's security. So I only have 1 minute. So I would only say the second about the second issue. What are the key escalation pathways on the Korean Peninsula? I think there are 7 pathways. First, the DPRK continues to vigorously develop its nuclear actual combat capabilities. Second, the U.S., Japan, and ROK further strengthen the large-scale joint military drills, and the U.S. further strengthen extended deterrence and conduct more frequent activities of its strategic assets on the Korean Peninsula and its surrounding waters. Third, contingency, similar to Kinnan warship and the Yangping Island incidents, breaks out between the South and the North. Fourth, the U.S. and ROK strengthen the deployment of THAAD in ROK. 5, the United States redeploy tactical nuclear weapons in ROK or agree to nuclear sharing with the ROK and Japan. 6th, ROK decides to develop its own nuclear weapons. 7, the DPRK's nuclear and missile tests show that it will soon have the capability to attack the U.S. mainland. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so yesterday I was asked to make comments focusing on Professor Bun and Professor Jia, so I'll go that way. And they asked me to provide some Korean perspectives about the issue today, so that's kind of my focus today. So I'll start from Professor Bun, your presentation, your paper. So I'll start from what I agree with you. First of all, no one will disagree that we need to prevent escalation on the Korean Peninsula. Nobody will like things going out of control. So I totally agree with you saying in your presentation and your paper that, quote, avoiding unnecessary, undue provocation is a fundamental part of successful deterrence, quote end. And the second part I agree with, that is deterrence
involves very complicated calculations. So particularly in the Korean context, we are not just dealing with North Korea. So the U.S., Washington and Seoul, they deal with Pyongyang, but at the same time, they have to think about responses, reactions from major actors, including Beijing, Moscow, and Tokyo. Well, so I agree with your point, but I have to. When I thought about your presentation and papers, I couldn't stop thinking about this. That is, so my impression through your presentation, that was the key argument was we don't have to push Pyongyang into corner, and we should do everything not to provoke North Korea, because North Korea, if they feel threatened in terms of security, and they have nuclear weapons, and things can go out of control. But one thing kind of missing from your presentation, that was South Korea's security concerns. That's what I want to ask, and that's what I want to focus. So it is important to alleviate North Korea's security concerns. But the thing is, I'm afraid that if we step too far, if some actions we take may undermine South Korea's security. So for successful deterrence, you mentioned that we need to avoid unnecessary, undue provocation, and at the same time, reassurance is important. I agree. But the thing is, well, we should think about the first and the most important requirement for successful deterrence is capabilities, strong capabilities to deter attack from North Korea. So the other things, kind of the scenarios you mentioned at the end of paper and presentation, you provided 5. And then when I thought about them, we should think about trade-offs between strong U.S. ROK alliance versus the things, the scenarios you mentioned. U.S. ROK alliance, ROK-U.S. alliance is strong. It is strong because of regular drills, military exercises, and we share the trainings. And it is strong because of weapon systems we adopted from the United States and operational doctrines 2 countries have built up together and developed together. But, well, North Korea always shows the signs of they are paranoid with what we have done so far. So they have hated them. So that's that. The other things, I have to keep thinking about how to balance, keeping our allies strong with Washington versus to alleviating the security concerns of North Korea. So that's kind of the first thing we should think about. And the second is, going back to the scenarios you mentioned, such as reducing temperature and reassurance in peacetime. One thing I want to mention is we have been there. We have been there from 1990s, sunshine period, and throughout the process of six-party talks, even Washington provided kind of negative security assurance to North Korea, but the result was just kind of same. We just watched North Korea being wild and provocative. So, what would you say about kind of lessons we have learned throughout the 3 decades of dealing with North Korea? We have tried everything virtually, diplomacy and sanctions and sometimes coercion, but we are still here. So what would you say about the kind of lessons we learned? That's kind of the second question I had. And about Jia, Professor Jia, I agree with you that with growing rivalry between Washington and Beijing, the chance for cooperation to denuclearize North Korea is getting slim. But here's the thing, just kind of recent development. Even though kind of China is worried about this Seoul going too close to Washington, but the thing is, I want to remind you of the fact that Washington and Seoul didn't shut Beijing out from the whole process. Think about Washington, the declaration last week. They came up with kind of the extended deterrence. But the thing is, all sources say that Washington and Seoul have closely consulted with Beijing and let it know that we are making this kind of advanced progress. So we wanted to stay in the loop. Okay? So I think that cooperation is still possible between Washington and Beijing, and including Korea. And the another thing is, well, I would say that Beijing better wake up and issue to the reigning North Korea's provocation. As Professor Park Won-kwon mentioned earlier, Korea's voice for nuclear armament is still strong out there. Even though the extended deterrence promised in the Washington Declaration this time maybe mute the voice temporarily, but depending on what's going on with North Korea, at the same time depending on what's going on with Beijing about reigning in North Korean nuclear program or missile programs, the voice can resurface any time. So China shouldn't China shouldn't say that I won't do anything or I can't do anything because of bigger issues like the U.S. and the China rivalry. I think that's not good for the Chinese national interest. So one thing just I want to say, the last thing I want to say is, well, key factor deciding South Korea's distance with Washington, that was definitely North Korea. And that also decided distance South Korea has with Japan. So let me wrap up my comment with the concluding remarks, Professor Jia, you mentioned. So China, it is never late to do a good thing. Let's hope.
Okay, the time is almost up, but let me add very briefly a very short question to three presenters. First one is Professor Matthew Byrne on the effectiveness of extended deterrence. As I briefly mentioned, North Korea's Kim Yo-jong mentioned extensively on criticized the one specific word of the end of North Korean leadership. If North Korea used the tactical nuclear weapons, how would you evaluate that kind of exchange of views on extended deterrence from your point of view? And second, Professor Cha Ching-woo, it is very clear you are very pessimistic about the future of U.S. China relations in the short-term period, but how would you evaluate the long-term perspective of U.S. China relations right after the Bali summit between two presidents? There was a brief period of thawing. Blinken used the word, the United States will start the Office of the China Coordination. And also Wang Yi also mentioned there are possibility of the period of the exploration. How would you forecast? Well, sooner or later there will be another meeting between two. How would you expect? Final question to the Professor Park Won-kwon. Security guarantee issues based on the Washington Declaration. The next step will be we have to give us some kind of the positive signal toward the North Korea returning back to the dialogue. In that cases, the crucial issues might be the security guarantee, but from our point of view of denuclearization, we can security guarantee of non-nuclear leadership. But it's very difficult for us to give a security guarantee of nuclear leadership. How can we solve this kind of dilemma? Because of limited times, I think the three paper presenters will respond very briefly to the comments and my personal comments in a rather 2 or 3 minutes.
So first of all, I want to thank all of the commenters for their interesting thoughts and questions. It is absolutely true that my paper focused less on building up the capabilities of the alliance than on thinking through what that might imply, because I felt that the building up of the capabilities was already the focus, and the new thought I wanted to inject was more thinking through how the adversary might respond. But you're absolutely right that there's a need to maintain capability for deterrence, and that's what makes the security dilemma a dilemma. With respect to the question about Kim Jong-un's criticism of the U.S. and ROK position that any use of nuclear weapons would lead to the end of the North Korean regime, his primary goal is maintaining the North Korean regime, and so of course he's going to criticize that position. He wants to deter us from doing anything that would threaten his regime, just as we want to deter him from using nuclear weapons. But I think that one part of our effort to deter him from using nuclear weapons is convincing him that his regime won't be threatened by us as long as he doesn't attack South Korea, undermine South Korea, use nuclear weapons, etc. If I could just comment in a sentence or two on Professor Jie's useful paper, I would say that the United States' point of view would be that China has done at least as many things to impose competition on the United States as the United States has done to impose competition on China. And I think this is that both China and the United States are sort of failing to see the security dilemma that I was talking about and failing to think through, gee, if we do this, how will that be seen in the other capital, and how will that provoke? I'm very hopeful that we will get back to talking to each other at a senior level. Secretary Blinken has already said that he hopes to schedule his trip to China soon. And I think, as you said, that there are so many challenges the world faces that can only be solved if China and the United States are working together. I mean, there's the Korean Peninsula, but globally, one can immediately think of 3 giant challenges that cannot be solved unless our countries work together. Avoiding nuclear war, avoiding catastrophic climate change, and avoiding catastrophic global pandemics, all of which our global society is coping with right now as we speak. So I share your desire for our countries to figure out ways to begin getting back to more productive relations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your useful comments. Basically, I want to make 2 points. One is, well, China has its own share of responsibilities for the deterioration of the relationship. That's for sure. We can handle it better if we have if we can do it another time. But it's unfortunate that we can't. The second point I want to emphasize is that probably at the moment we are facing opportunity for stabilization and maybe even improvement of the relationship. The U.S. had the midterm election. After the midterm election, Biden no longer needs the votes to pass the legislations for domestic purposes because he can't. Right? So he has greater flexibility in terms of handling the China problem, China issue, okay? Its relationship with China, okay? Like the tariffs, Trump imposed on U.S. imports from China. It doesn't make any sense. It contributes to the inflation of the U.S. They should have done something about it. And also, in China, we have the 20th Party Congress, okay? And you have new faces, and these at the top are loyal to the present party secretary. So it's time to deliver, okay? And after 3 years of COVID and economic situation is not, growth is quite low, so it's time to restore the economic growth. And domestically, we want to encourage the private entrepreneurs to play a larger role. Overseas, we need a stable international environment. The key to that, environment is the U.S. We need to work out a relationship with the U.S. So both sides have the need to do something to stabilize the relationship. But the problem we have is, this Taiwan problem. The Congress, which doesn't, which is under no control, but itself, and itself cannot control itself. So it's pushing this Taiwan problem ahead of us. Okay. So it's Taiwan problem is the core interest of China. China cannot give in. So so now we have a terrible situation. That is, both sides say that they need high level and governmental direct dialogues. And Blinken is supposed to come to China, but the problem is we have, Congress passing this law and that legislation, visiting this, sending people to Taiwan and try to sell arms to Taiwan, that sort of thing. So what can you do? Okay. So we are facing this problem. It's like China selling weapons to Texas. Okay. So, supporting, arguing that the U.S. government and Texas have to have a peaceful settlement. This is incredible. So something have to.
I wish the U.S. government in Texas would have a peaceful settlement.
You feel offended if you're American if China does that. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Professor Ha asked a very difficult question, and how do we give a security guarantee to North Korea? First of all, North Korea wanted to have the so-called their right to survivor, and this is one of the conditions that North Korea will have the dialogue, meaningful dialogue with the United States. And then they are saying that the right to survivor includes, first of all, the permanent halt of the South Korea-U.S. joint military exercise, and at the same time, permanent halt of the deployment of the strategic asset of the United States to the Korean Peninsula. And then this is actually going on. The final part is the withdrawal of the U.S. forces in Korea. And to me, I don't think North Korea's at least the leadership of North Korea have a really serious security threat from South Korea or United States. I think North Korea well aware that South Korea, United States do not have any plan to strike preemptively or forced to North Korea. South Korea, United States have an operational plan 5015, and we will revise to as the 5022. And then there is no way to strike first to North Korea, unless North Korea will have a very clear signal that they are going to launch their nuclear missiles. Then it is kind of international right and self-defense we have a preemptively strike in that missiles. But other than that, there is no way to strike first or start war against North Korea. Politically, I don't think any president, both from the United States and South Korea, will start war against North Korea. So I think North Koreans know this fact very well. So this is a very difficult question. And at the same time, but we have to talk about their security issue, and at the same time, we have to talk about their economy issue too. But at this very moment, especially the United States, I'm pretty much frustrated that they don't put the North Korean issue at any top agenda in their foreign policy at all. Still, the special representative of Song Kim is staying in Indonesia, and then And this, especially Washington talk and the Washington Declaration, the summit between South Korea and the United States a couple of days ago, both presidents haven't mentioned at all the possibility of dialogue with North Korea at all. Even though the joint statement mentioned that the dialogue and diplomacy is the only solution, permanent solution of the Korean Peninsula problem, but they haven't mentioned at all, especially President Biden. And at the same time, I still don't know what the calibrate and practical approach to North Korea made by the Biden administration. So what I'm trying to say is that both United States and South Korea, of course, with help of China, to do more actively to pursue some kind of dialogue or diplomacy front at this moment. But at the same time, your first question, it is very important and essential that South Korea need to enhance our own deterrence with the cooperation of course, United States and Japan. And then there is a so-called integrated deterrence that introduced by the United States last year, NDS National Defense Strategy. I think that's a very vital way to enhance our deterrence. So South Korea actively pursue this integrated deterrence with the United States. And at the same time, as already mentioned, that we have to no choice but to have the beef up the trilateral cooperation among three countries. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
Okay, next session is supposed to start 11:10. So it's almost impossible for me to open the floor, but I would like to invite one very brief question from the floor.
It's a great honor to have a talk. I have a question to John Park. And you explained the ineffectiveness of economic sanctions toward North Korea as a superbug phenomenon, and assuming that sanctions against North Korea are antibiotics. There are various forms of sanctions, such as asset freeze, suspension of aid, and financial sanctions. And I think the financial sanctions are relatively effective rather than the other measures. However, an obstacle to financial sanction is outliers who provide an exit to North Korea, such as China. And I would ask John Park that, what do you think about persuading that outliers like China for effective financial sanction and deterrence? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Let me be brief. The two main points that come up in terms of the application of economic statecraft, I think a lot of the studies show that sanctions are effective when it's a policy tool embedded in a larger strategy. And so as we've heard right now in dealing with North Korea, there's a lot of stalemate, things are stalled. Sanctions have increasingly become, in some instances, the strategy itself. So with that, there are some important elements, and there are different types of sanctions. The ones that focus on trying to impede the further growth of the North Korean nuclear weapons program, I think is a priority for all. As we heard from Professor Bun, there are common areas for cooperation. In that respect, the need for sanctions and the increasing application of them for that particular purpose, I think is a common area of global cooperation. The second thing I wanted to mention is related to your point about sanctions. Under the broader heading of economic statecraft, the rationale, the reason why I posed a question to Professor Jha about the way that China is debating and thinking about responding to U.S. economic statecraft, as a large number of the security issues that we've heard from the various speakers are unfolding and there's greater discussion about and preparations as well. The next step in terms of economic statecraft can inform, whether accurately or not, different types of threat perceptions and can amplify and accelerate. So I do believe that the critical phase and an important area of cooperation for us is to think about the economic competition and the economic statecraft piece very carefully, because it can trigger path-dependent type of reactions that can be very difficult to contain. And so I agree with all the members of the panel here in terms of focusing on the security piece. But as we're focused on that, the area that we need to manage very, very carefully is the economic statecraft piece. Thank you for your question.